When my wife and I went to China for the first time in 1996, we saw what was apparently a new world emerging. Looking at old Chinese newsreels of the early part of the 20th century and reading accounts of what the ancient dynasties were like, suggested that China had gone through a huge change. Firstly, after the collapse of the Qing Empire at the end of the 19th century and ending in 1912, then through the warlord period and the Civil War, which disrupted everything, and then the communist period where the party tried to get rid of all the old economic, political, religious and social systems and start afresh. And it appeared that they had been pretty successful, and a great deal, most of Chinese culture and history had been deleted, and China was starting again. On top of that, there was the increasingly amazing development, economic and social and legal and educational, of China from Deng Xiaoping's reforms in the 1980s, gathering momentum. And during our visits from 2002, we saw this huge transformation in China. So from our own observations and from talking to young Chinese, it looked as if there was a decisive break. China was an old civilization, obviously, but the previous 2,000 plus years had been 90% wiped away in just half a century or so. And that continued to be my impression, and that, talking to my young friends, is their impression, that they are modern, and this modernity stems from a generation ago. They are separated even from their parents, who were born in the pre-modern period, and now they are modern. What has happened, as happened with England and Japan, I found that this was largely a myth, and that I could rediscover a hidden history of China, which isn't nearly as simple and divided as that. And again, I'll illustrate it by taking the year, shall we say, 1996, when we first went to China, and look from there backwards and see how many of the institutions of China and its deep characteristics are modern, and how many of them go back well before the 19th century. Starting with one of the easy ones, which is language. Although Mao and the communists simplified the Chinese language, it has basically not changed for 2,500–3,000 years at least. It's still a pictographic or logographic language which depicts whole words with a single character, and it is the sole example existing on this planet of a large civilization which has preserved an ancient writing form which has been deleted in most of the world by alphabetic languages. So the language is not something that is modern, it is very ancient. The next thing one could look at is the imperial bureaucratic system. The more you watch, even today, the activities of government in China, the more you are reminded, at least I am, of ancient descriptions of Chinese government. That is to say, it's based on bureaucracy. It's based on trained officials who carry out the policies which emanate from the centre, and there are layer after layer of this bureaucracy which encompass the whole of this vast civilization. So it is the one great bureaucratic civilization on Earth. And again, if you look at that structure, you see that it dates back to at least 2,000 years ago, the Han Dynasty, and was inaugurated by the first emperor who united China, the Qin Emperor, in 221 BC. That is a very unusual form of government. Traditionally in Western Europe, for example, rule was done by an armed nobility who were the power holders, and the same in Japan and elsewhere. But the Qin Emperor got rid of the gentry class and the nobility. He saw that this could lead to huge divisions and separations in a country like China. So he replaced them with highly educated, trained civil servants who were obedient to the center. And so the political system of China obviously has replaced the emperor by the secretary of the Communist Party and the emperor's entourage of advisors and eunuchs and bureaucrats by different sets of people. But the fundamental pyramid structure of power coming up to the top to a single person and then going down right through down to the most local level and then coming up, that pyramid bureaucratic structure is basically the one that China still has, and it hasn't been changed for a while. During the Communist Party rule, it was replaced by communes and other mechanisms, but it's reasserted itself and is in essence and structure what it has been for 2,000 years. Another feature that one could look at, or set of features, is to do with the society. The underpinning institution of China for several thousand years has been the family. The family in which the concept of who you were related to flowed through males, so it was what's called an agnatic system, and this meant that you formed into groups, smaller groups and larger of lineages, and then larger groups of clans of people with the same surname, which is one of the reasons there are so few surnames in China, because there are these very powerful, particularly in the south, clans which organized much of life. They were the economic, to a considerable extent the political, the religious with the clan ancestors, and social units on which China has based itself for millennia. Now, it's obvious that the clan system, the wider clan system, was dissolved to a considerable extent in the 20th century, and now is not very powerful, though there's some remnants of it in the south and west, but on the whole it's gone down to a smaller unit of the family. But the family system of China is still, if you compare it to the West, very different and has some of the essence of the old Confucian system. In other words, you have considerable hierarchy and respect between parents and children. You have a concept of mutual interdependence, so that you have a responsibility to your parents, and a great deal of economic and social and other interaction between closer relatives. Traveling around China, for example, with my young Chinese students, we have met up with her and their cousins and relatives, and we can see that they are much more important throughout a Chinese person's life than the relatives of the English tend to be, at least apart from the aristocratic families. So the Chinese family system is evolving and changing swiftly, but it's got many of the elements of the older system, but stripped down for a more mobile and economically developed country. Another feature which is very striking about Chinese social structure for a long period is the absence of any kind of stratification. That is to say, you can't talk about caste, birth-based differences, which you find in India, for example. There is no caste system and never has been. There has been periodic slavery, people captured in war or through debt, bondage or whatever, but that's not caste. So there's no caste system, nor is there really a class system. As I mentioned, the first Qin emperor started the revolution that abolished the feudal gentry, and so the normal orders that you get, even to a certain extent in England, whereby you have poorer people, middle-class people, yeomen and so on, gentry, upper middle class, that is very weakly and has been very weakly developed in China. There is no real big distinction between townspeople and country people. Country people come into the towns and make a living and are successful or not. Townsmen move out. So it's a terribly fluid system, one based on a huge amount of competitive economic and other activities to elevate yourself, to escape from poverty into a reasonable standard of living. But you can't buy your way up the system, and there is no firm structure. And that ties in very well with the educational system. In almost all societies, education is a mechanism for consolidating and demarcating class differences. In England, public schools and so on, universities have had that function for a long time. In China, the system is very modern, a long time ago. It's meritocratic. In other words, China is the one country which has had for centuries the idea that you promote people and give them their position later in life on the basis of their academic, intellectual merit. A complex and highly organized system of examinations from the lowest level, and a few people get through that to the next level, and so on and so on, and just a tiny percentage get up to the very top. And that system is still present to a considerable extent. My students and others, when I talk about their life, I can see them a mirror of that. They go to a good local school, they are very successful there. They go to a better middle school, they're successful there. A high school, they go to one of the top universities, and they go up and get a top job. So the Gaokao, as it's called, which is the universal educational examination that all Chinese should take unless they're going to be educated abroad. The Gaokao covers the whole of China, and on the basis of how you do in that single exam, you will be allocated a slot to a certain extent for life. You'll go to one of the top universities or less good university. That will determine your fate. So it's an educational meritocracy rather than a class-based, landed system, as in most of the rest of the world. Another feature of the social structure is the high mobility. Although China is a vast and famous peasantry, I've been impressed when I look at particular parts of China at how much geographical mobility there is. Inheritance in the family system, traditionally the land was owned by the family and not by the individual. So you could stay on the land because you'd be automatically an heir to your parents. But for various pressures and reasons, such as poverty and famines and just the desire to do better, many people took on side jobs, and many people left their hometown and went off into the cities and into other occupations. So China, from the pictures we have of it by travellers and others, was a bustling sort of movement place. If you look at the pictures of medieval cities in China, they're just filled with people whizzing around and in the countryside. So it's not geographically immobile. From an impression, it's much less fixed and static than large parts of India, for example. So the social structure has changed, obviously, but it's in essence not different from what it has been for some centuries. Looking at the economy, again you get the situation of vast change, obviously, with modern technologies and banking systems and so on recently, with an older, deeper pattern whereby basically the Chinese are great and very active and energetic and innovative economic actors. One description of them might be penny capitalism. They're often very small traders, very small manufacturers, craftsmen, with small amounts of capital, but they're constantly involved with that. China has for centuries had a very developed marketing system with large markets, smaller markets, tiny markets, and commodity capitalism of a certain kind. Everything is for sale, and it's had a currency which has facilitated that because it had tiny denominations. One of these capex, for example, could buy a slice of melon or get someone to carry your goods for 100 yards, and you carried many of these around and exchanged them. So it's constantly trying to make small profits, profit-driven, economically very focused, and everyone acknowledged this. The Japanese, for example, used to say that if you needed someone to work out your finances and your business and so on and understand markets, the Chinese were far better at that. And it's not a surprise now that given that deep interest, love and concern with bartering, trading, making, outdoing other people, China has in a very small period, given the new tools of technology and advanced marketing and financing, has become the workshop of the world and will probably overtake the United States as the largest economy shortly. And that's very old. So the economy is not something new. If you read 19th century accounts of even in a poor and disrupted period of Chinese history, a huge amount of economic and production. They're also, like the Japanese, extremely good designers. Chinese for a while were known as shoddy goods manufacturers, as were the Japanese right at the beginning of their industrialization. But they weren't traditionally. Traditionally, Chinese objects were the envy of the West. Wonderful silken clothes, wonderful ceramics, excellent furniture, all sorts of things the Chinese made very well. So they were industrial, and money-driven. So that's some features of the Chinese economy. Then if you look at their ideology, if you look at China today and ask what is the sort of central characteristic of their ideology, and one good answer to that would be pluralistic and tolerant. All sorts of ideas gel together in China. You don't have a single god, you don't have monotheism, and you never have had. There are over 100 million Christians now, and they're tolerated mostly. But on the whole, it's sort of summed up in the greeting that was common in 19th century China. When you met someone, you'd say, "What is your religion?" Or ritual system, shall we say, because it's not really a religion. And people would say, "Well, I'm a Taoist," or "I'm a Confucian," or "I'm a Buddhist," or whatever. And you'd say, "Oh, good, great on you." And in fact, most people weren't any of these. They were all of them. And so, as in some other societies, you could be simultaneously a practicer of the Tao, a Buddhist. On occasion, you would worship or celebrate your ancestors. You'd be all the different forms of religion mixed together, and they weren't religion because there was no God in any of them. It was, in fact, an enchanted civilization. In other words, the natural landscape and the social and cultural landscape of human beings were absolutely mixed up together. You can see this in the concern, for example, in the power of the winds and the waters, feng shui, or you can see it in the force of qi, energy, as in tai chi, or you can see it in astrology and the force of the stars, and you can see it in the beliefs in many kinds of spirits, including your ancestors, but many others as well. So nature was alive. It hadn't been deadened. And that ancient system, going back thousands of years, is basically the one I was surprised to find is still the case. When I scratch the surface of some of my more sophisticated students and others, they would say, "Oh, yes, of course, we believe in all those powers and forces, and we use feng shui, and we prognosticate, and so on, as if that was perfectly compatible with being very well educated and aware of Western scientific thoughts and so on. There's no clash between them. And that is a huge and continuous system which differentiates China from the West. Returning to something I should have mentioned under society, the basic feature of difference between China and the West is, and particularly the Anglosphere, is that in the Anglosphere we start with the individual and then build up society from the individual and create fictional or contractual groups of people who are doing various things. In China you start from the top, the group, and then you have the individuals hanging off the group. And that applies both at the family level, the regional level, and the national level. The Communist Party, in its avowed concern for the whole of China and to make life better for all Chinese and to put group benefits before individual benefits, which you see in everything from the response to COVID to the huge emphasis on national infrastructure and all sorts of other things. The Chinese are concerned about making life better for the group, and the individual will benefit. Public affluence and perhaps occasionally private squalor, as Galbraith, reversing Galbraith, whereas we start with the individual, private affluence, and sadly, as Galbraith said, quite often public squalor. So it's a totally different attitude towards the relationship between groups and individuals. And another feature, very important to understand, which is very old and continuous, is that in social relations, everything is about relations. It's not about me, it's not about you, it's about our relationship to each other. You see this in the huge prevalence of gift giving, the huge prevalence of relationship building, as in Guangxi, the sets of people you trust and work with, strangers and others. And you have your meaning from reflecting and interacting and working with the other. This is one of the reasons why the Chinese are extraordinarily good at working together, whether it's in the army and fighting the Japanese, or whether it's in producing wealth and goods. And they are a team-playing society, which is based on the meaning of life being about a relationship. One obvious example and support for this is Confucianism, because the whole of Confucianism is what anthropologists might call a structural approach to life, which is that meaning doesn't lie in the individual, but in the relationship A to B, which is C. And in Confucianism, you don't have a single hand clapping. You are in a certain relationship with your father, your mother, your brothers, your children, neighbors, and so on. And each time it is the relationship, usually hierarchical, so fathers are above children, older brothers are above younger brothers, and so on. But it is all about relationships, and that is very different from the atomistic, individualistic way in which I was built up or educated at school. Finally, in terms of aesthetics and art, it was a puzzle, it must have been a puzzle to many young Chinese, that on the one hand they were told that they were modern and everything had started in 1949 or later, or maybe in 1912 with the downfall of the Qing. In other words, pre-20th century, China was a different and distant world, a foreign country where they did things differently. And yet when Chinese looked at their literature and their art, they felt, yes, this is us, I understand it. When they heard the great traditional music of China, Qing and drums and so on, when they looked at the huge and exquisite history of painting in China, when they read the great classics of Tang and other poetry going back to the 8th, 9th century, when they looked at the porcelain and ceramics, in every sphere, and when they read novels or encountered any or looked at Chinese gardens or every aspect of aesthetics and art which represent people. The Chinese recognized their close ties. For a while, of course, a lot of it was suppressed. Much aesthetics and art was denigrated as the old for a period in recent Chinese history. But it's all flooded back, and it's become much more obvious because even in the time that we've been going seriously, the last 20 years, to China, much of traditional Chinese opera, the Kunchu and Beijing opera, much of Chinese painting, poetry, all those things have flooded back into China. They didn't disappear. They were for a time suspended, but they are back again. So the Chinese aesthetic and artistic system, which is so rich and strong, it's a great civilization of art and poetry, goes back hundreds, thousands of years and has not changed. So putting it all together, China is on the surface modern, with the most sophisticated communication systems, both physical, railways and planes and all those sorts of things, and electric cars and the rest of it, and also in communications in terms of electronic communications and computers and smartphones and so on. It's the most sophisticated in the world by far now. And in many other ways, the cities are absolutely amazing, vast, and with gleaming and wonderful architecture in many of them, and parks and so on. So the material external world of the Chinese has been totally transformed in the last 40 years. But if you go down to what anthropologists call habitus, that is the traditional deep generative structures of your behavior and how you act and how you think and how you perceive the world, that habitus, or customs as it used to be called, has not been severed at any point. China is an ancient civilization, the most ancient continuous civilization on earth, and it still speaks the same language, thinks in many of the same ways, acts in many of the same ways as it has for centuries. That is its power and its force. And in that sense, China is not modern in the divisions that modernity brings in the West. It doesn't separate out different aspects of life, the political, the social, the economic, the religious. It blends them in a way which is unfamiliar to us, but gives it great cohesion and explains why it has been able to survive for thousands of years, and against the huge shocks it has had from Mongol or Manchu or Western invasions over those centuries. And so China is very durable and in many ways very simple in its structure, and a really interesting alternative to what I was brought up with in the West.